This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. This story examines the human cost of pride, the importance of community intervention, and the lasting impact on families and neighborhoods when communication breaks down. It serves as a reminder that behind every conflict are real people with hopes, fears, and loved ones who suffer the consequences of unresolved tensions. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The summer of 1986 arrived in Clearwater, Florida, with the kind of oppressive heat that made everyone move a little slower, think a little less clearly. On Cypress Ridge Road, a 2-mile stretch of asphalt that cut through scrub pines and palmetto bushes, the only sounds were usually the distant hum of air conditioners and the occasional rumble of a motorcycle engine cutting through the humid air. Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she hung laundry on the line behind her small yellow house. At 62, she had lived on Cypress Ridge for nearly 20 years, watching the neighborhood slowly change from rural farmland to a mix of working-class families and the occasional cluster of motorcycle enthusiasts who appreciated the area's isolation and cheap rent. "Mama, you shouldn't be out in this heat," called her daughter Carmen from the kitchen window. Carmen, 34 and recently divorced, had moved back home with her 8-year-old son Miguel after her marriage fell apart. "The clothes won't dry themselves, Mija," Maria replied, though she paused to rest in the shade of the orange tree that had been there longer than any of the houses. She noticed fresh tire marks in the dirt across the street, where the old Henderson place sat empty, its "for rent" sign weathered and faded. Down the road, Tom Bradley was under the hood of his 1979 Camaro, trying to coax life back into the engine that had been giving him trouble for weeks. At 28, Tom worked construction during the day and spent his evenings either working on cars or riding his Harley with a loose group of friends who called themselves the Road Warriors. It wasn't really a club in any organized sense, more like guys who enjoyed the freedom of the open road and the camaraderie that came with shared mechanical troubles and cold beer after long rides. "Hand me that wrench, would you?" Tom called to his neighbor, Pete Morrison, who was leaning against the fence that separated their properties. Pete, a Vietnam veteran in his early 40s, kept mostly to himself, but had gradually warmed up to Tom over the months since Tom had moved in. "Engine trouble again?" Pete asked, passing over the tool. "Always something with this old girl," Tom grunted, adjusting a belt, "but she's got character." Pete nodded, understanding the attachment men formed to machines that served them faithfully, despite their flaws. "You hear anything about new folks moving into the Henderson place?" Tom straightened up, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. "Saw some bikes there yesterday evening. Looked like maybe 3 or 4 guys checking it out." The Henderson place had been empty for 6 months since old Walter Henderson died of a heart attack. His daughter in Tampa had been trying to rent it out, but the rural location and the house's need for repairs had made it a hard sell. The property sat on nearly 2 acres, with a large garage that Walter had used for his woodworking hobby and enough space for several vehicles. That evening, as the sun began to set and the temperature dropped to a merely uncomfortable level, the rumble of motorcycle engines announced the arrival of something new to Cypress Ridge Road. Tom stepped out onto his front porch, beer in hand, and watched as a convoy of 5 Harley-Davidsons pulled into the Henderson driveway. The riders were clearly experienced, their movements efficient as they dismounted and began unloading gear from saddlebags and a small trailer one of them had been pulling. Tom could see leather vests with patches, though he was too far away to make out the details clearly. The men moved with the purposeful coordination of people who had ridden together for a long time. "It looks like the Henderson place finally found some tenants," Tom called over to Pete, who had also emerged from his house to observe the new arrivals. From her kitchen window, Maria Santos watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and mild concern. She had nothing against motorcycle riders. Some of her late husband's friends had been decent men who happened to enjoy riding, but something about the way these men carried themselves suggested they were more organized than the casual riders she was used to seeing in the area. The leader of the group, a tall man with a graying beard, surveyed the property with the eye of someone evaluating its strategic value rather than its comfort. He pointed toward various spots around the yard while speaking to his companions, his voice too low for the neighbors to hear, but his gestures clear and decisive. Over the next few days, the pattern of life on Cypress Ridge Road began to shift subtly. The new residents, who neighbors learned belonged to a motorcycle club called the Iron Brotherhood, kept regular schedules. They were quiet in the mornings, worked on their bikes in the afternoons, and often rode out as a group in the evenings, returning sometimes well after midnight. Carmen Santos found herself checking the locks on her doors more carefully, not because of any specific incident, but because of an undefinable change in the atmosphere of the neighborhood. Miguel asked why the new neighbors always wore the same leather vests, and she struggled to explain the concept of motorcycle clubs to a child who only knew the world through the lens of cartoons and elementary school. Tom Bradley made his first real contact with the newcomers when one of their bikes broke down directly in front of his driveway. The rider, a stocky man in his 30s with calloused hands and oil-stained fingers, was examining his engine when Tom approached. "Need any help?" Tom offered. "I'm pretty good with engines." The man looked up, assessing Tom with careful eyes before nodding. "Carburetor's giving me trouble. Name's Danny." "Tom," he replied, already reaching for his toolbox. "Let's take a look." Working together, they diagnosed and temporarily fixed the problem, a clogged jet that would need a proper cleaning but could be managed for the short term. Danny's manner was friendly but guarded, offering information about himself sparingly, while asking casual questions about the neighborhood, how long Tom had lived there, who else was around. "Appreciate the help," Danny said, as he prepared to restart his bike. "Iron Brotherhood takes care of people who take care of us." It was said as a statement of fact rather than a threat, but something in the phrasing made Tom pause. "Iron Brotherhood, that your club?" "More than a club," Danny replied, his bike roaring to life. "It's family." That night, Tom found himself thinking about the interaction as he sat on his porch listening to the cicadas. There had been nothing overtly threatening about Danny or their conversation, but the man's intensity and the way he had emphasized the concept of family suggested a level of organization and loyalty that went beyond casual weekend riding. Pete Morrison had his own encounter with the new neighbors a few days later, when one of their dogs, a large German shepherd that had appeared with them, got loose and wandered into his yard. Pete had always been good with animals, and the dog responded well to his gentle approach. "Sorry about that," said the man who came looking for the dog. He was younger than the others, maybe early 20s, with nervous energy and quick movements. "Rex doesn't usually wander off." "No problem," Pete replied, handing over the dog's makeshift leash. "He's well-trained, military background." The young man's face lit up slightly. "Jake served 2 tours. He's the one who trained Rex. I'm Bobby." Pete nodded, recognizing something familiar in Bobby's manner, the particular way veterans carried themselves, the way they assessed their surroundings. "Vietnam myself, infantry." For a moment, the two men connected over shared experience, but then Bobby seemed to remember where he was and who he represented. "Well, thanks again for catching Rex. We'll make sure he stays closer to home." As Bobby walked away with the dog, Pete wondered about the dynamics within the Iron Brotherhood. Bobby seemed younger and less hardened than the others, possibly looking for the same sense of brotherhood and purpose that many veterans struggled to find in civilian life. The subtle changes continued. Maria Santos noticed that her usual morning walks down Cypress Ridge Road now took her past motorcycles that seemed to be positioned strategically, always with a clear view of both directions on the road. The men were invariably polite when she encountered them, nodding respectfully and moving aside if she needed to pass, but their watchfulness was constant. Carmen worried about Miguel riding his bicycle on the road, not because anyone had said anything threatening, but because the presence of the Iron Brotherhood had changed the character of the neighborhood in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The easy, rural informality was being replaced by something more structured and controlled. The change became more apparent when Tom's usual riding group, 5 or 6 guys who met irregularly for weekend trips to Daytona or the Keys, gathered at his house for their weekly planning session. They sat around Tom's kitchen table with maps and beer, plotting routes and discussing which bikes needed maintenance before their next ride. "Who are the new guys?" asked Rick, a mechanic who lived in Clearwater proper. "Saw them when I was coming up the road. Pretty serious-looking operation." Tom found himself defending the Iron Brotherhood, despite his own reservations. They've been decent neighbors so far. Quiet, keep to themselves mostly. But even as he said it, he realized that their presence had changed his own behavior. He found himself being more careful about when he worked on his bike outside, more aware of who might be watching when his friends came over. The easy freedom he had enjoyed living on the quiet road was being replaced by a subtle but persistent sense of being observed. As the first month of the Iron Brotherhood's residence passed, the residents of Cypress Ridge Road settled into an uneasy routine. There had been no incidents, no direct confrontations, no obvious reasons for complaint. Yet everyone felt the shift, a tension that hung in the humid Florida air like the promise of an approaching thunderstorm. The road that had once been simply a place where people lived was becoming something else, a territory marked by invisible boundaries and unspoken rules that none of them fully understood yet, but all of them could feel settling into place around them. The first real friction began on a Tuesday morning in late July, when Miguel Santos crashed his bicycle trying to avoid what he thought was a confrontation, but was actually just a misunderstanding. The 8-year-old had been riding to his friend's house 3 blocks away when he encountered 2 Iron Brotherhood members working on a motorcycle in their driveway. Bobby, the younger veteran Pete had met, was holding a wrench, while Jake, the older man who owned the German Shepherd, lay underneath a Harley troubleshooting an oil leak. Miguel had heard his mother and grandmother talking in hushed, worried tones about the motorcycle men, absorbing their anxiety without understanding its source. When he saw the 2 men in the driveway, his child's mind translated their focused attention on the mechanical problem into something threatening. He swerved sharply to give them a wide berth, lost control on the sandy shoulder, and went down hard, scraping his knee and elbow on the asphalt. Bobby immediately dropped his tools and ran over. "Hey, you okay, kid?" Miguel, fighting back tears and embarrassed by his fall, scrambled to get back on his bike without looking at Bobby. "I'm fine," he mumbled, though blood was already seeping through his torn jeans. "Whoa, hold on," Bobby said gently, crouching down to Miguel's level. "That's a pretty good scrape. We should clean that up before it gets infected." But Miguel's only thought was to get away as quickly as possible. He pedaled off unsteadily, leaving Bobby standing in the road with a confused expression, watching a frightened child disappear around the bend. When Miguel arrived at his friend's house with torn clothes and bloody knees, the friend's mother, Janet Phillips, immediately called Carmen Santos. "Miguel's had an accident," she said. "He says some motorcycle men scared him." The story, filtered through an 8-year-old's limited ability to explain complex emotions and a concerned mother's protective instincts, transformed in the telling. By the time Carmen picked up Miguel and brought him home, she understood that the motorcycle men had somehow caused her son's accident, though the details remained unclear. "What exactly happened?" Carmen asked Miguel as she cleaned his wounds in their bathroom. "I was just riding my bike and they were there and I got scared and crashed," Miguel said, which was technically accurate but left out crucial context about his own assumptions and reactions. Carmen's protective instincts flared. These men, whoever they were, had somehow created an environment where her child felt unsafe riding his bicycle in his own neighborhood. She had been willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, but now the situation had directly affected her family. That evening, as Tom Bradley worked in his garage with the doors open, he could hear raised voices from the Santos house next door. Through the thin walls and open windows necessitated by the heat, he caught fragments of a conversation between Carmen and Maria about those men and Miguel's accident, and not safe for children anymore. The next morning, Tom encountered Carmen as she walked to her car for work. Her usually friendly demeanor was notably cooler. "Morning, Carmen," he said, trying to gauge her mood. "Tom," she replied curtly. "I suppose you haven't heard about what happened to Miguel yesterday." Tom's confusion was genuine. "No, what happened? Is he okay?" Carmen's expression softened slightly at his obvious concern. "He crashed his bike trying to avoid those friends of yours, scraped up his knee pretty badly." "Friends of mine?" Tom asked, genuinely puzzled. "The motorcycle people. I know you ride with them sometimes. Tom realized the assumption Carmen had made, that because he rode a motorcycle and worked on bikes, he must be associated with the Iron Brotherhood. Carmen, I've never ridden with those guys. I barely know them. What exactly happened to Miguel? As Carmen explained the incident, Tom began to understand how miscommunication and assumptions had created the first real conflict in their previously peaceful neighborhood. Miguel had been scared because of things he'd overheard adults saying. Bobby had been trying to help, and now Carmen believed the Iron Brotherhood had somehow threatened her child. I should probably talk to the guy who tried to help Miguel, Tom suggested. Clear up what actually happened. Carmen's expression hardened again. I think it's pretty clear what happened. My son can't even ride his bike safely in his own neighborhood anymore. That afternoon, Tom walked down to the Henderson place, intending to have a casual conversation with Bobby about the incident. He found several Iron Brotherhood members working on their bikes in the garage, the space filled with the sounds of tools and engines and classic rock playing from a paint-splattered radio. Looking for Bobby, Tom said to Jake, who seemed to be the senior member present. Jake looked up from the carburetor he was rebuilding, his expression neutral but watchful. Something we can help you with? Just wanted to talk about what happened yesterday with the kid. Bobby emerged from underneath a motorcycle, wiping grease from his hands. The boy who crashed his bike, is he okay? I tried to help, but he took off before I could do anything. Tom found himself in the awkward position of mediating between his neighbors and people he barely knew. His mother thinks he was scared of you guys. Scared of us? Bobby's confusion seemed genuine. I was just trying to help. Kid took a pretty hard fall. Jake's expression grew more serious. What exactly is the mother saying happened? Nothing specific, Tom said carefully. Just that her son felt unsafe and that's why he crashed. The temperature in the garage seemed to drop several degrees. Jake set down his tools and gave Tom his full attention. Unsafe how? We doing something that's making people feel unsafe? Tom realized he had inadvertently introduced the possibility that the Iron Brotherhood was being accused of threatening behavior. Look, I think it's just a misunderstanding. The kid got spooked, crashed his bike, and his family's upset, no big deal. But Jake's expression suggested it might be a bigger deal than Tom realized. Brother, let me ask you something. You live on this road, right? You see us doing anything that would make a kid feel unsafe? No, Tom answered honestly, but maybe people don't know what to expect. It's a pretty quiet neighborhood, and you guys are organized. Different from what folks are used to. Jake nodded slowly. Different how? Tom struggled to articulate something he himself didn't fully understand. More professional, I guess, like you're here for a reason beyond just having a place to live. The garage fell silent except for the radio. The other Iron Brotherhood members had stopped their work to listen to the conversation. Tom realized he had stumbled into something more significant than a simple neighborly chat about a child's bicycle accident. Tom, right? Jake said finally. Let me explain something to you. Iron Brotherhood isn't just a motorcycle club. We're veterans, most of us. We've been riding together for 8 years. We came here because we needed a place where we could live peacefully, work on our bikes, and not bother anybody. But we're also not going to be pushed around or made to feel unwelcome because people don't understand what we're about. I don't think anyone's trying to push you around, Tom said. Maybe not yet, Jake replied. But when people start saying we make their kids feel unsafe, when neighbors start talking about us like we're some kind of threat, that's usually how it starts. Bobby, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. I was trying to help that kid. If his family thinks we're dangerous, maybe I should have just stayed in the garage. No, Jake said firmly. You did the right thing. If we stop being decent people because others make assumptions about us, then we become what they think we are. Tom left the conversation feeling like he had accomplished nothing positive and possibly made things worse. The Iron Brotherhood clearly felt they were being unfairly characterized, while Carmen and her family genuinely believed their safety and peace of mind were being threatened. Both sides seemed to have reasonable points, but those points weren't connecting. That evening, as Tom sat on his porch trying to process the day's events, he noticed an unusual amount of activity at the Henderson place. More motorcycles had arrived, he counted at least 8, and the garage lights stayed on well past their usual bedtime. The sound of multiple conversations carried on the night air, though he couldn't make out specific words. Around 10 o'clock, his phone rang. It was Pete Morrison. "You see what's going on down the road?" Pete asked. "Looks like they have company." "Tom, I need to tell you something. I talked to Bobby this afternoon after whatever conversation you had with them. Kid seemed pretty shaken up, said something about people thinking they're dangerous. What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, that people are nervous because they don't know what to expect. But Tom, I also told him that nervous people sometimes make bad decisions, and bad decisions can escalate situations that don't need to be escalated." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've seen this before, in different contexts. Two groups of people who don't understand each other, both convinced the other side is the problem. Each side starts taking precautions, and pretty soon the precautions look like preparations for conflict." The next morning brought a new development that confirmed Pete's concerns. Maria Santos discovered that someone had spray-painted a small symbol on the stop sign at the corner of Cypress Ridge Road and Miller Avenue, a stylized iron cross with IB underneath it. The symbol itself wasn't threatening, but its presence represented a change in the neighborhood's character that made Maria deeply uncomfortable. She had grown up in neighborhoods where territorial markings meant the difference between safety and danger, and though this was rural Florida in 1986 rather than urban Texas in the 1950s, the sight of spray paint claiming territory brought back familiar anxieties. When Carmen drove Miguel to school that morning, she noticed the marking and immediately called the sheriff's department from her office phone. Deputy Rebecca Martinez, a young officer who had grown up in Clearwater, took the call. "Ma'am, you said there's graffiti on a stop sign?" Deputy Martinez asked. "It's not just graffiti," Carmen explained. "It's some kind of symbol. Those motorcycle people who moved into the Henderson place, I think they're marking territory." Deputy Martinez knew about the Iron Brotherhood. They had checked in with the sheriff's department when they moved to the area, providing contact information and explaining that they were a veterans motorcycle club looking for a quiet place to live. The check-in had been professional and voluntary, which had left a positive impression. "Mrs. Santos, have you had any direct problems with these individuals? Any threatening behavior?" "They scared my son," Carmen said, then recounted Miguel's bicycle accident. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but what you're describing sounds like a child getting frightened and a man trying to help. As for the symbol on the stop sign, that's a minor vandalism issue. I can send someone to look at it, but it's not necessarily criminal activity." Carmen hung up feeling frustrated and unheard. The official response seemed to minimize her legitimate concerns about changes in her neighborhood. If law enforcement wasn't going to take the situation seriously, she would have to find other ways to protect her family and community. That afternoon, she drove to Janet Phillips's house to talk with the other mother about the morning's developments. Janet lived in a small subdivision about a mile from Cypress Ridge Road, but her son Tyler was Miguel's best friend, and she had been following the situation with growing concern. "I think we need to organize the neighbors," Carmen said, as they sat in Janet's kitchen while their sons played video games in the living room. "At least make sure everyone knows what's happening." Janet nodded. "My husband knows someone on the county commission. Maybe there's something they can do about the rental situation." "What do you mean?" "Well, if that property isn't properly zoned for whatever kind of operation they're running, maybe the county can address it that way." The idea of using bureaucratic channels to address their concerns appealed to Carmen. It seemed more constructive than simply complaining to unresponsive sheriff's deputies, and it avoided direct confrontation with people she was increasingly convinced might be dangerous. Over the next several days, Carmen and Janet made a series of phone calls to county offices, asking questions about zoning regulations, occupancy limits, and business licensing requirements for the Henderson property. They didn't make accusations or demands, but rather presented themselves as concerned citizens seeking information about their rights and the regulations governing their area. Meanwhile, the Iron Brotherhood became aware that their new neighbors were asking questions about them. Jake received a phone call from his landlord, Walter Henderson's daughter in Tampa, asking if there were any problems with the rental arrangement. Someone from the county called, asking about how many people are living at the property and whether we're running any kind of business, she explained. I told them it's a residential rental with adequate parking for your vehicles, but they seem to think there might be some kind of commercial activity going on. Jake assured her there was no business being operated from the property, but the conversation left him troubled. Official inquiries suggested their neighbors weren't content to simply coexist with discomfort. They were taking active steps to find ways to force the Iron Brotherhood to leave. That evening, he called a meeting of all Iron Brotherhood members in the area, not just those living at the Henderson place, but the 8 others who lived scattered around Central Florida and rode with the group regularly. "Brothers," he began, "we've got a situation developing here that needs to be addressed before it gets out of hand." The meeting, held in the Henderson garage with the doors closed, lasted nearly 3 hours. Members shared their observations about neighborhood tensions, discussed their options, and tried to develop a strategy for dealing with what they perceived as an escalating campaign to drive them away. "Maybe we should just move on," suggested Bobby. "Find somewhere else where people aren't so uptight about motorcycles." "No," said Danny, the stocky man who had accepted Tom Bradley's help with his bike. "If we run every time people get nervous about us, we'll never have anywhere to call home." Jake nodded agreement. "Besides, running now sends a message that we were up to something wrong in the first place. We're not criminals, we're not causing problems, and we're not going anywhere." "So what do we do?" asked another member. "We make it clear that this is our home now and we're not going to be pushed around by people who don't understand us," Jake replied. The decision to stay and assert their right to live peacefully in the neighborhood seemed reasonable to the Iron Brotherhood members, but their method of making that clear would prove problematic. Over the next week, they began marking additional spots in the area with their symbol, not as territorial claims, but as simple declarations of their presence and permanence. The iron cross with IB appeared on the mailbox post at the end of their driveway, on a tree beside the road in front of their property, and on the metal guardrail where Cypress Ridge Road crossed a small creek about a quarter-mile from their house. To the Iron Brotherhood, these markings were similar to the way homeowners might put up lawn ornaments or decorative signs, simple expressions of identity and belonging. But to their neighbors, the markings represented an expanding territorial claim that made the motorcycle group's presence feel increasingly ominous and permanent. Tom Bradley found himself caught in the middle when Carmen Santos approached him directly about the situation. "Tom, I know you said you don't ride with them, but you work on motorcycles and you understand their culture," she said. "Can you talk to them? Explain that the symbols and everything are making people nervous." Tom agreed to try, though he was increasingly doubtful that communication would solve a problem rooted in fundamentally different perspectives on what constituted normal, acceptable behavior in a residential neighborhood. His second visit to the Henderson place was notably different from the first. This time, Jake met him at the end of the driveway rather than inviting him into the garage. "Tom," Jake said, his manner friendly but formal, "what brings you by?" "Some of the neighbors are concerned about the symbols showing up around the area," Tom said directly. "Concerned how?" "They see them as territorial markings, like you're claiming ownership of public spaces." Jake's expression grew hard. "And what do you see them as?" Tom chose his words carefully. "I see them as you guys trying to establish yourselves in the neighborhood." "But Jake, intention doesn't always match perception. So you think we should remove them? Give in to people who are looking for reasons to complain about us? I think you should consider whether those symbols are worth the conflict they're creating." Jake was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Tom, let me ask you something. If your neighbors decided they didn't like the way you maintained your lawn, would you change how you took care of your property to make them happy?" "That's different." "How is it different? We're not doing anything illegal. We're not bothering anyone. We're just living our lives in a way that's authentic to who we are." Tom realized that Jake had a point, but he also understood that the Iron Brotherhood's idea of authentic self-expression was creating genuine fear and discomfort among people who had every right to feel safe in their own neighborhood. "Jake, I understand what you're saying, but you have to understand that perception creates reality for the people who live here. If they feel threatened, they're going to take action to protect themselves." "What kind of action?" The question hung in the humid air between them, loaded with implications neither man wanted to explore fully. That night, Tom called Pete Morrison to discuss his growing sense that the situation was moving beyond simple neighborly disagreement towards something more serious. "The problem is that both sides are right," Tom said. "The Iron Brotherhood has every legal right to live where they want and express their identity how they see fit. But the neighbors have every right to feel comfortable in their own community. And when everyone's right but nobody's happy, that's when things get dangerous," Pete replied. "Tom, I've been thinking about this a lot. These Iron Brotherhood guys aren't bad people, but they're operating like a military unit in a civilian environment. Structure, hierarchy, loyalty, territory. Those concepts mean something different when you're not dealing with other military people. You think they're dangerous? I think they're prepared. And preparation can look a lot like planning, especially to people who don't understand military thinking." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple motorcycles starting up at the Henderson place. Through his window, Tom could see lights moving as the Iron Brotherhood members prepared for one of their evening rides. But tonight, the formation looked different. Instead of the casual group ride pattern he had observed before, the motorcycles moved in a precise convoy, with defined spacing and obvious coordination. They were riding like a unit with a mission, rather than friends out for recreation. As the sound of engines faded into the distance, Tom wondered where they were going and what they intended to accomplish. More importantly, he wondered what kind of message their organized presence would send to anyone who encountered them on the roads around Clearwater that night. The answer came the next morning when Deputy Martinez received 3 separate calls about a motorcycle gang that had ridden through the center of Clearwater in formation, creating what callers described as an intimidating display near the courthouse and city hall. The Iron Brotherhood had decided to make their presence known beyond the boundaries of Cypress Ridge Road, and the implications of that decision would soon make themselves felt by everyone involved in the growing conflict. Deputy Rebecca Martinez arrived at the Clearwater Sheriff's Department that Thursday morning to find Sheriff William "Bill" Crawford waiting for her with a cup of coffee and a folder containing the previous night's incident reports. At 58, Sheriff Crawford had seen enough small-town conflicts escalate into serious problems to recognize the warning signs, and the reports on his desk were setting off alarm bells. "Becky, tell me what you know about this Iron Brotherhood situation," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. Deputy Martinez opened her notebook and reviewed the timeline. Motorcycle club, about 15 members total, mostly veterans. They moved into the Henderson rental property on Cypress Ridge Road about 6 weeks ago. Since then, we've had complaints about territorial markings, concerns about a child's safety, and now reports of intimidating behavior in town. What's your assessment? Honestly, Sheriff, I think we have 2 groups of people who don't understand each other, and both sides are starting to make assumptions that could turn this into something serious. Sheriff Crawford nodded grimly. "Walk me through yesterday's incidents." According to the reports, the Iron Brotherhood's convoy had ridden through downtown Clearwater around 8:30 the previous evening, maintaining formation and stopping at several locations, including the courthouse, the city hall, and the sheriff's department itself. At each stop, they had parked in organized rows, dismounted, and spent several minutes walking around the area before returning to their bikes and moving to the next location. "Were they doing anything illegal?" Crawford asked. "No, sir. Public spaces, no disruption of traffic, no threatening behavior toward anyone. But 3 separate citizens called it in as suspicious activity, said it looked like reconnaissance." "Reconnaissance for what?" "That's the problem. Nobody knows. But when you have a dozen men in matching leather moving in formation and stopping at government buildings, people start imagining all kinds of scenarios." Sheriff Crawford had dealt with motorcycle clubs before, both legitimate and criminal. The Iron Brotherhood's behavior pattern didn't match typical outlaw activity, but it also wasn't the casual riding of weekend enthusiasts. The organized nature of their movement suggested purpose and planning, which made civilians nervous and law enforcement watchful. "Have you had any direct contact with their leadership?" "I spoke with Jake Morrison when they first moved in. He was professional, provided contact information, said they were veterans looking for a quiet place to live. But that was before the neighborhood complaints started." "Time for another conversation," Crawford decided. "But first, I want to talk to the neighbors who've been calling in complaints. get a better sense of what's really happening out there. That same morning, Carmen Santos was discovering that her efforts to build community support for addressing the Iron Brotherhood situation were yielding unexpected results. What had begun as conversations with concerned neighbors was evolving into something more organized and potentially more confrontational than she had intended. Janet Phillips had contacted her husband's friend on the county commission, who had put them in touch with a residents' association from a nearby subdivision that had successfully fought against a proposed motorcycle rally venue 2 years earlier. The association's president, a retired insurance executive named Robert Chen, had agreed to meet with Carmen and other Cypress Ridge Road residents to discuss their options. "The key is documentation," Chen explained as he sat in Janet Phillips' living room with Carmen, Maria Santos, Tom Bradley, Pete Morrison, and 3 other neighbors who had been drawn into the expanding circle of concern. "You need to establish a pattern of behavior that violates county regulations, creates public safety issues, or diminishes property values." Carmen appreciated the systematic approach, but Pete Morrison looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Mr. Chen, with all due respect, these aren't criminals we're talking about," Pete said. "They're veterans who happen to ride motorcycles. Maybe instead of looking for ways to force them out, we should be looking for ways to address everyone's concerns." Chen's expression suggested he had heard similar arguments before and found them naive. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your sympathy for fellow veterans, but the reality is that organized motorcycle groups, regardless of their members' service records, often bring problems that communities aren't equipped to handle. Drug activity, violence, intimidation, these issues tend to escalate over time. Have we seen any evidence of drugs or violence?" Pete asked. "The territorial markings, the organized rides, the intimidating behavior downtown, these are classic escalation patterns," Chen replied confidently. Tom Bradley had been listening to the conversation with growing unease. He understood his neighbor's concerns, but Chen's approach felt like it was designed to create conflict rather than resolve it. "What exactly are you proposing?" Tom asked. Chen opened a briefcase and pulled out several documents. "First, we document every incident, no matter how minor. Second, we research the property rental situation to ensure they're in full compliance with occupancy and zoning regulations. Third, we petition the county to conduct a public safety assessment of their activities. And fourth, if necessary, we organize a formal residents' association that can take legal action to protect the neighborhood." Carmen found herself nodding along with Chen's plan, relieved to have someone with experience guiding their efforts. But Maria Santos, who had lived through enough community conflicts to recognize when situations were moving beyond reasonable boundaries, felt increasingly troubled by the meeting's tone. After Chen left and the other neighbors dispersed, Maria asked Carmen to stay behind for a private conversation. "Mija, I'm worried about where this is going," she said in Spanish, her voice carrying the weight of years and experience. "What do you mean, Mama? We're just trying to protect our neighborhood." "I've seen this before," Maria continued in Spanish. "Good people who start fighting other good people because they're afraid, and then the fear becomes bigger than the actual problem." Carmen switched to English, partly to include Janet Phillips, who had been cleaning up coffee cups but was clearly listening, and partly because her own thoughts were clearer in her adopted language. "Mama, these aren't just random people. They're organized, they're marking territory, they're making shows of force in town. That's not normal neighbor behavior. And organizing against them with lawyers and petitions and documentation, is that normal neighbor behavior either?" The question hung in the air as Carmen struggled to articulate her growing conviction that the Iron Brotherhood represented a threat that required organized response, while Maria watched her daughter choose a path that could lead to conflict with consequences none of them could foresee. That afternoon, while the residents of Cypress Ridge Road were forming their defensive strategies, the Iron Brotherhood was dealing with the results of their previous night's ride through town. Jake Morrison received a call from Sheriff Crawford requesting a meeting, and the tone of the conversation made it clear that this would be more formal than Deputy Martinez's initial welcome visit. Jake agreed to meet at the Sheriff's Department the following morning, then called an emergency meeting of all Iron Brotherhood members. The garage at the Henderson place had become their informal headquarters, But tonight the atmosphere was tense rather than relaxed. "Brothers, we need to talk about last night's ride," Jake began. "Apparently our presence downtown has people concerned." Danny, who had organized the convoy formation, looked defensive. "We didn't do anything wrong. Public roads, public spaces, no laws broken." "That's not the point," Jake replied. "The point is that our actions are being interpreted as threats, whether we intend them that way or not." Bobby, the youngest member, raised his hand tentatively. "Maybe we should explain what we were actually doing. I mean, we were just checking out the area, getting familiar with the town we're living near now." "Explain to who?" asked another member. "The people who already think we're dangerous criminals? They're not interested in explanations." Jake looked around the garage at the faces of men who had served their country, found brotherhood in shared experience, and now faced the prospect of being driven from another place they had hoped to call home. "Here's what I think," he said finally. "We have two choices. We can try to make ourselves smaller, change how we live and ride, and present ourselves to make other people more comfortable. Or we can stand our ground and make it clear that we belong here just as much as anyone else." "What does standing our ground look like?" Danny asked. "It means we don't hide who we are. We don't remove our symbols. We don't change our riding patterns to avoid being seen. And we don't let ourselves be pushed around by people who want us gone." The decision to maintain their current approach felt principled to the Iron Brotherhood members, but it also meant that neither side in the growing conflict was willing to make the accommodations that might have prevented escalation. Sheriff Crawford's meeting with Jake Morrison the next morning was professional but pointed. The two men sat across from each other in the sheriff's office while Deputy Martinez took notes. "Mr. Morrison, I want to be direct with you," Crawford began. "We're getting reports about your group's activities that suggest some people feel intimidated. I need to understand what you're trying to accomplish." Jake's military bearing was evident as he responded calmly and clearly. "Sheriff, we're veterans trying to live peacefully in a community where we can afford rent and have space for our motorcycles. We're not trying to intimidate anyone." "Then help me understand last night's ride through town. Formation riding, stops at government buildings. What was the purpose of that?" "Getting familiar with the area. Same thing anyone does when they move to a new place. Drive around, see what's there." "In formation? All wearing matching colors?" Jake's jaw tightened slightly. "Sheriff, we're motorcycle riders. We ride together, we wear our club colors, we maintain safe spacing. That's not criminal behavior." Crawford nodded. "You're right, it's not criminal. But it's being perceived as threatening, and perception can become reality pretty quickly in a small community. So what are you asking us to do?" "I'm asking you to consider how your actions are being interpreted and whether there are ways to be good neighbors without compromising who you are." Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sheriff, can I ask you something? If a group of residents decides they don't want us in their neighborhood, what rights do we have?" "The same rights as any other citizens. You can't be forced to leave without cause, and you can't be harassed for lawful activity. And if they find ways to make our lives difficult, use regulations and ordinances and bureaucratic pressure to force us out." Crawford recognized the question for what it was. Jake was asking whether law enforcement would protect the Iron Brotherhood's rights if the conflict escalated. "Mr. Morrison, I'll enforce the law fairly for everyone involved, but I'd prefer to help everyone find a way to coexist before we get to the point where enforcement becomes necessary." Jake left the sheriff's department with mixed feelings. Crawford seemed fair and professional, but the meeting had made it clear that the Iron Brotherhood's presence was officially recognized as a potential problem. They were being watched, their actions were being interpreted through a lens of suspicion, and their neighbors were actively working to build a case against them. That weekend brought the first direct confrontation between the two sides. Miguel Santos had been riding his bicycle with his friend Tyler Phillips, practicing for a school bike-a-thon that was scheduled for the following month. The boys had permission to ride on Cypress Ridge Road as long as they stayed together and didn't go past the Henderson place. As they approached the Iron Brotherhood property, they could see several members working on motorcycles in the open garage. Bobby noticed the boys slowing down and called out, "Hey, nice bikes!" Miguel, remembering his previous crash and his family's warnings about the motorcycle men, immediately turned around and began pedaling back toward his house. Tyler, confused by his friend's sudden retreat but not wanting to be left alone, followed. Bobby, intending to be friendly and still feeling bad about Miguel's earlier accident, walked partway down the driveway. "Are you guys okay? Miguel, right? How's your knee healing up?" But to the boys, a leather-clad man walking toward them while they were alone on the road felt threatening. They pedaled faster, and Tyler, looking back over his shoulder to see if they were being followed, swerved off the road and crashed into a drainage ditch. Bobby immediately ran toward the accident, genuinely concerned that another child had been hurt. But his rapid approach toward two frightened boys triggered exactly the kind of incident everyone had been dreading. Tyler, muddy and scraped but not seriously injured, started crying loudly. Miguel, torn between wanting to help his friend and his fear of the approaching motorcycle man, began shouting, "Help! Help!" at the top of his lungs. The commotion drew attention from multiple directions. Carmen Santos, working in her garden, heard Miguel's distress calls and came running. Jake Morrison and Danny, hearing the same calls, emerged from the garage to see what was happening. The scene that unfolded was a perfect storm of misunderstanding and panic. Carmen arrived to find Bobby crouched beside Tyler, trying to help him out of the ditch, Miguel standing nearby crying and pointing at Bobby, and two other Iron Brotherhood members approaching rapidly from their property. "Get away from him!" Carmen shouted, her maternal instincts overriding any rational assessment of the situation. Bobby stood up quickly, his hands raised. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to help. The boy crashed his bike." "Tyler! Miguel! Come here right now!" Carmen commanded, and both boys ran toward her. By this time, Jake and Danny had reached the scene, and their presence transformed what could have been resolved as a simple miscommunication into a tense standoff between Carmen, with two frightened children behind her, and three members of the Iron Brotherhood who were trying to understand why their attempt to help had created such a dramatic reaction. "Ma'am, we were just trying to help," Jake said calmly. Bobby saw the boy crash and went to make sure he was okay. By chasing them down the road, Carmen's voice was shaking with anger and adrenaline. "I wasn't chasing anyone," Bobby protested. "I was trying to help." Pete Morrison, drawn by the commotion, arrived just as the confrontation was reaching its peak tension. He quickly assessed the situation and positioned himself between the two groups. "Everyone take a step back," he said in the authoritative voice he had developed during his military service. "Carmen, are the boys hurt?" "Tyler's scratched up, but they're okay," she replied, her voice still tight with stress. Pete turned to the Iron Brotherhood members. "What happened?" Jake explained their version of events while Carmen interjected with her own interpretation, and Pete realized that the same incident had created two completely different narratives that were probably both partially accurate. "Look," he said finally, "this was an accident that happened while people were trying to help, but right now everyone's upset and not thinking clearly. I suggest we all go home and talk about this later, when emotions aren't running so high." Carmen left with the two boys, but not before telling Jake, "This is exactly what we've been worried about. Our children can't even play safely in their own neighborhood anymore." Jake watched her go, then turned to Bobby with frustration. "Brother, what did I tell you about staying away from situations that could be misinterpreted?" "I was just trying to help," Bobby repeated, but his voice carried the weight of someone who was beginning to understand that his good intentions were being viewed through a lens of suspicion that transformed every action into a potential threat. That evening, Carmen called an emergency meeting of the informal residence group that had been forming around the Iron Brotherhood issue. The afternoon's incident was exactly the kind of escalation they had been fearing, and it provided concrete evidence that their concerns were justified. "This proves what we've been saying," Robert Chen declared when Carmen described the confrontation. "These people are creating an environment where children can't play safely. That's grounds for legal action." Tom Bradley, who had been pulled into the residence group despite his reservations about their approach, tried to offer a different perspective. "Carmen, I understand why you were scared, but from what Pete told me, it sounds like the guy was genuinely trying to help Tyler after he crashed." "Tom, Miguel was calling for help," Carmen replied. "Children don't call for help unless they feel threatened. Children also don't always understand adult situations clearly," Tom said gently. But Chen was already moving the discussion toward action items. "We need to document this incident formally, file a complaint with the Sheriff's Department, and use it as evidence in our petition to the County Commission. As the meeting progressed, Tom found himself increasingly isolated in his belief that the situation could still be resolved through communication rather than confrontation. The other residents had moved past wanting to coexist with the Iron Brotherhood to actively working to remove them from the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the Iron Brotherhood was holding their own meeting to discuss the afternoon's events and their implications. The garage felt smaller with tension filling the space between the motorcycles and workbenches. "Brothers, we have a problem," Jake announced. "That woman today looked at Bobby like he was a predator stalking her children, and from what I've been hearing, that's becoming the general opinion about us in this neighborhood." Danny kicked at a wrench on the floor. "So what do? We can't help kids who get hurt without being accused of threatening them. We can't ride through town without being called intimidating. We can't even live in our own house without people calling the county to complain about us." "Maybe we should have that community meeting," suggested another member. "Get everyone together, explain who we are, clear the air." Jake shook his head. "A meeting implies we think we've done something wrong. Besides, they don't want to understand us. They want us gone." Bobby, who had been quiet since the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Jake, maybe they do want us gone. But if we keep acting like we're under siege, we're going to turn into exactly what they think we already are." The comment hung in the air as the Iron Brotherhood members grappled with a fundamental question. How do you maintain dignity and brotherhood when the community around you views both as threats? And at what point does defensive solidarity become the kind of aggressive posture that justifies others' fears? The weekend's incident had moved the conflict from the realm of mutual misunderstanding into something more serious. Both sides now had concrete grievances, documented complaints, and growing conviction that the other group represented a genuine threat to their safety and way of life. As the sun set on Cypress Ridge Road that night, residents locked their doors with more care than usual, while the Iron Brotherhood members checked their motorcycles and equipment with the thoroughness of people who no longer felt welcome in the place they had hoped to call home. The stage was set for a final escalation that would force everyone involved to confront the consequences of choices made in fear, pride, and the fundamental human need to protect what matters most. The call came to Sheriff Crawford's personal line at 5:47 on a Tuesday morning in early September, pulling him from sleep with the urgency that meant serious trouble. Deputy Martinez's voice was tight with stress as she delivered news that confirmed his worst fears about the Cypress Ridge Road situation. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. Someone firebombed 3 motorcycles at the Henderson place last night. No injuries, but the Iron Brotherhood is talking about retaliation, and the neighbors are saying it proves they were right to be scared." Crawford was already reaching for his uniform. "Any witnesses? Evidence?" "Not yet. The bikes were parked behind the house, away from the road. Whoever did it knew the property layout and waited until around 3 a.m. when everyone was asleep. Jake Morrison says they heard the explosion, but by the time they got outside, whoever did it was gone." "What about the neighbors?" "That's the problem, Sheriff. Carmen Santos called in around the same time to report that someone threw a rock through her kitchen window with a note wrapped around it. The note said, 'This is what happens when you mess with family.'" Crawford closed his eyes, recognizing the signs of a conflict that had spiraled beyond community policing into something that would require serious intervention. "I'm on my way. Set up a perimeter around both properties and don't let anyone talk to media until I get there." The events that had led to this morning's violence had unfolded over the previous 2 weeks, like a textbook example of how reasonable people could make unreasonable choices when fear and pride replaced communication and compromise. It had started with Robert Chen's petition to the County Commission, which had been more successful than anyone anticipated. Within days of submitting their formal complaint about the Iron Brotherhood's intimidating presence and territorial behavior, Chen had received a call from Commissioner Patricia Williams requesting a meeting to discuss the residents' concerns. Commissioner Williams, a former social worker who had been elected on a platform of responsive local government, had listened carefully to the residents' documented complaints about territorial markings, intimidating behavior, and threats to child safety. The afternoon incident with Miguel and Tyler had been particularly compelling when presented alongside photographs of the Iron Brotherhood symbols around the neighborhood and witness statements about their organized rides through town. "What specific action are you requesting from the commission?" Williams had asked. Chen presented a three-point proposal. First, a formal investigation into whether the Henderson property was being used in violation of residential zoning regulations. Second, enhanced Sheriff's Department patrols of Cypress Ridge Road to ensure public safety. Third, a public hearing where residents could formally present their concerns and the Iron Brotherhood could respond. Williams had agreed to all three requests, setting in motion a series of official actions that would make the Iron Brotherhood's situation increasingly untenable while providing them with a public forum to defend themselves. The zoning investigation had been conducted by County Inspector Margaret Torres, a thorough professional who approached her job with careful attention to regulations and precedents. When she arrived at the Henderson property on a Thursday afternoon, she found Jake Morrison waiting for her with lease documents, occupancy permits, and vehicle registration information neatly organized in a folder. "Mr. Morrison, I need to inspect the property to ensure compliance with residential zoning requirements," Torres had explained. "Of course. What specifically are you looking for?" Torres had walked the property systematically, checking for signs of commercial activity, inappropriate modifications, or occupancy violations. The garage contained motorcycles, tools, and repair equipment, but nothing that exceeded what might be expected for enthusiasts maintaining their personal vehicles. "How many people are currently living on the property?" Torres asked. 4 residents as listed on the lease. Other club members visit regularly, but they have their own homes. The neighbors have expressed concern about the number of vehicles and people here regularly. Jake had remained calm and professional throughout the inspection, but Torres could see the tension in his shoulders as he answered questions that felt designed to find problems rather than verify compliance. "Inspector Torres, we're in full compliance with our lease agreement and county regulations. We're not running a business. We're not exceeding occupancy limits, and we're not violating any zoning restrictions. What exactly are the neighbors alleging?" Torres had been honest with him. "They're alleging that this is functioning as a clubhouse or meeting place for a motorcycle organization, which could constitute commercial use of residential property. So if a bridge club met weekly at someone's house, that would be commercial use. That would depend on the nature and scope of the activities." Jake had realized that the inspection, while technically fair, was being conducted with the presumption that the Iron Brotherhood was probably violating something. Torres was looking for violations to justify the neighbors' complaints rather than simply verifying compliance. The inspection report, filed 3 days later, had found no current violations, but noted concerns about the potential for future commercial use, given the organized nature of the motorcycle group's activities. The language was carefully neutral, but it provided county officials with justification for ongoing monitoring. Meanwhile, Sheriff Crawford had implemented enhanced patrols of Cypress Ridge Road, which meant deputy cruisers driving through the area twice per shift instead of the usual random patrol pattern. The increased law enforcement presence was intended to reassure residents, but it had the effect of making the Iron Brotherhood feel like they were under surveillance in their own neighborhood. Deputy Martinez found herself making frequent contact with both sides as minor incidents accumulated. A complaint about motorcycles being too loud in the morning, a report of Iron Brotherhood members staring threateningly at neighbors, an allegation that someone had tampered with the Santos family's mailbox, a counter-complaint that someone had thrown trash in the Henderson property's driveway. Each incident individually was minor, but collectively they painted a picture of a neighborhood where normal interactions had become loaded with suspicion and hostility. The public hearing, scheduled for the 3rd Tuesday in September, had been intended to provide a forum for rational discussion and conflict resolution. Instead, it became the catalyst for the final escalation that led to Tuesday morning's violence. The Clearwater County Commission chambers had been more crowded than usual, with nearly 60 people attending to observe or participate in the Iron Brotherhood hearing. Chen and the residents group had prepared a presentation with photos, timeline documentation, and witness statements. Jake Morrison had requested permission to address the commission on behalf of the Iron Brotherhood. Commissioner Williams had opened the hearing by explaining the process and emphasizing the importance of civil discourse. We're here to address community concerns and find solutions that respect everyone's rights. This is not a trial, and no one is being accused of criminal behavior. Chen's presentation had been polished and persuasive. He displayed photos of the Iron Brotherhood's territorial markings, described the intimidating effect of their organized raids, and detailed the incident with the children that had escalated residents' fears. His argument was that the Iron Brotherhood's behavior, while technically legal, was incompatible with the peaceful residential character of Cypress Ridge Road. Commissioner Williams, we're not asking you to discriminate against these individuals because they ride motorcycles, Chen had concluded. We're asking you to protect a residential neighborhood from activities that are transforming it into something fundamentally different from what residents chose when they made their homes there. Jake's response had been equally well prepared, but carried the weight of personal conviction rather than political strategy. Commissioners, Iron Brotherhood is comprised of veterans who served our country and are trying to live peacefully in a community we can afford. We maintain our vehicles, we ride together for fellowship and safety, and we've never threatened or harmed anyone. We're being judged not for our actions, but for assumptions people make about what motorcycle riders represent. He had addressed each of the residents' complaints systematically, providing context and alternative interpretations for behavior that had been characterized as threatening or territorial. The symbols we've placed around our property and the immediate area are expressions of identity, not territorial claims. We don't own Cypress Ridge Road, but we do live there, and we have the same right to feel at home in our neighborhood as anyone else. The hearing had proceeded civilly for nearly an hour, with commissioners asking clarifying questions and both sides providing thoughtful responses. But the tone had shifted when Commissioner Williams asked about the Iron Brotherhood's long-term intentions for their presence in the area. Mr. Morrison, help me understand what the Iron Brotherhood hopes to achieve by maintaining a residence in this particular location, Williams had asked. We hope to live peacefully and be good neighbors, Jake had replied. But you're also clearly more than just individual residents who happen to ride motorcycles. You're an organized group with shared identity and purpose. What is that purpose? Jake had paused, recognizing that his answer would either reassure the commissioners or confirm their concerns about organized motorcycle groups. Commissioner, Iron Brotherhood provides fellowship and support for veterans who share common experiences and common challenges transitioning to civilian life. We ride together because riding is freedom, and we've all earned the right to be free. We live together because we understand each other in ways that civilians sometimes don't. The answer had been honest, but it also confirmed commissioners' suspicions that the Iron Brotherhood saw themselves as fundamentally different from their civilian neighbors, with different needs and different standards for community behavior. Commissioner Williams had then asked the question that crystallized the fundamental conflict. Mr. Morrison, are you willing to modify your group's activities in ways that would address your neighbors' concerns about territorial markings and organized demonstrations of presence? No, ma'am, we are not, Jake had replied firmly. We will not change who we are or how we live to accommodate people who have decided to dislike us based on assumptions. The hearing had concluded without resolution, but with clear lines drawn between two incompatible visions of what constituted acceptable community behavior. The Iron Brotherhood would not compromise their identity or activities to appease neighbors who viewed those very activities as threatening. The residents would not accept the continued presence of a group whose self-expression made them feel unsafe in their own neighborhood. Over the following week, tensions had escalated through a series of incidents that pushed both sides toward actions they would later regret. Someone, never identified, had spray-painted "Veterans Welcome" over the Iron Brotherhood's territorial markings, transforming symbols of identity into statements of political defiance. The Iron Brotherhood had responded by adding more markings, including a large iron cross painted on the road surface at the entrance to Cypress Ridge Road. Carmen Santos had organized a neighborhood watch group that began documenting Iron Brotherhood activities with photographs and written logs. The watch group's presence meant that Iron Brotherhood members could no longer leave their house or work on their motorcycles without being observed and recorded by people who viewed their every action as potentially threatening. The Iron Brotherhood had responded to constant surveillance by becoming more defensive and insular. They installed privacy fencing around their property, posted no trespassing signs, and began accompanying each other when running errands or riding anywhere in the area. The final provocation had come when someone called Child Protective Services to report that children in the neighborhood felt unsafe due to the presence of organized criminals. The investigation had been brief and found no basis for concern, but the implication that Iron Brotherhood members might pose a threat to children had pushed their anger beyond reasonable limits. "They want to call us criminals," Danny had said during an angry garage meeting the night before the firebombing. "Maybe we should show them what criminals actually look like." Jake had tried to maintain discipline and perspective, but the constant pressure and accumulating grievances were wearing down even his military-trained self-control. "Brothers, we cannot let them provoke us into becoming what they say we are," he had warned. "The moment we crossed that line, we proved they were right about us all along." But anger and frustration had overcome wisdom sometime after midnight, when someone, later suspected to be Danny but never proven, had decided that symbolic retaliation was necessary to demonstrate that the Iron Brotherhood would not be pushed around without consequences. The 3 motorcycles destroyed in the firebombing belonged to Iron Brotherhood members who lived elsewhere but regularly visited the Henderson property. The damage was extensive enough to total 2 of the bikes and severely damage the third, representing thousands of dollars in destruction and immeasurable emotional impact for owners who had invested years of work and passion in their machines. The rock through Carmen Santos's window had been thrown sometime after the explosion, suggesting it was retaliation for retaliation, an escalating cycle of symbolic violence that both sides understood could easily become something much worse. Sheriff Crawford arrived at Cypress Ridge Road to find a neighborhood in crisis. The Henderson property was surrounded by Iron Brotherhood members, examining the destroyed motorcycles and talking in tight groups about response options. The Santos house was similarly surrounded by neighbors who had gathered to offer support and express their own fears about what might happen next. Deputy Martinez met Crawford at the scene of the firebombing. "Sheriff, Jake Morrison is cooperating with the investigation, but he's also making it clear that his people expect us to find whoever did this." "What's he threatening?" "He's not threatening anything specifically, but he's saying that Iron Brotherhood takes care of problems that law enforcement can't solve." Crawford knew that motorcycle clubs often operated by codes of justice that didn't align with civilian law enforcement, and he recognized the warning in Jake's words. "What about the neighbors?" "They're scared. Carmen Santos is talking about moving her family out of the area until this gets resolved. Other neighbors are saying they want the Iron Brotherhood gone immediately, before someone gets hurt." Crawford walked between the 2 groups, making preliminary assessments and trying to understand how a simple neighborhood conflict had escalated to arson and threats of retaliation. His conversation with Jake Morrison took place away from other Iron Brotherhood members, in an attempt to reach the rational military veteran he believed still existed underneath the defensive anger. "Jake, I need you to help me prevent this situation from getting worse," Crawford said directly. "Sheriff, someone just destroyed our property and threatened our families. In our world, that demands a response. In my world, that demands an investigation and prosecution, but only if you let law enforcement handle it." Jake was quiet for a moment, then asked, "And if your investigation doesn't find anyone? If whoever did this just disappears and we're supposed to accept that someone can attack us without consequences? Then we keep investigating until we find them. But Jake, if your people take matters into their own hands, you'll force me to treat Iron Brotherhood as the criminals your neighbors already think you are." The ultimatum was clear: trust civilian justice or face treatment as outlaws. Crawford's conversation with Carmen Santos was equally direct, but focused on preventing further escalation from the residents' side. "Mrs. Santos, I understand you're frightened, but I need you to help me keep this from turning into something tragic. Sheriff, we told you this would happen. We documented everything. We followed proper channels, and now they're attacking families. How much more evidence do you need that these people are dangerous?" "Mrs. Santos, we don't know who firebombed those motorcycles. It could have been someone from outside the neighborhood trying to stir up trouble." Carmen's expression suggested she found that possibility unlikely. And the note that came through my window, was that someone from outside the neighborhood too? Crawford had no good answer for that question, because the note suggested that someone with knowledge of the neighborhood conflict had decided to escalate it into threats against families. The investigation that followed consumed the next week and ultimately revealed how thoroughly the situation had deteriorated beyond simple neighbor disputes. The firebombing had been committed by Tyler Phillips's older brother, Marcus, a 19-year-old who had been watching the conflict escalate and decided to do something about the motorcycle gang that was threatening his little brother. Marcus had no criminal history and no experience with arson. He had simply filled 3 glass bottles with gasoline, waited until the Iron Brotherhood members were asleep, and thrown them at their motorcycles before fleeing on foot through the woods behind the Henderson property. The rock through Carmen's window had been thrown by Bobby, the youngest Iron Brotherhood member, who had been overwhelmed by anger at being constantly viewed as a threat to children when he had only ever tried to help them. Both acts had been committed by individuals acting without authorization from their respective groups, but both had been motivated by the escalating dynamic of fear and pride that had consumed the entire neighborhood. The resolution came not through law enforcement or county intervention, but through the exhausted recognition that everyone involved had lost more than they could afford to keep losing. Jake Morrison and Carmen Santos's face-to-face conversation took place at Sheriff Crawford's suggestion in the neutral territory of the County Commission chambers, with Deputy Martinez present as a witness and mediator. "Mrs. Santos, I want you to know that Iron Brotherhood never intended to threaten you or your family," Jake said directly. "We came here looking for a place to live peacefully, not to create conflict." Carmen had struggled with her response, torn between her genuine fear and her growing realization that the motorcycle riders might be as trapped by the situation as she was. "Mr. Morrison, I believe you didn't intend to threaten us, but intention and impact aren't always the same thing. Your presence changed our neighborhood in ways that made us feel unsafe, whether you meant to or not. And our response to feeling unwelcome made you feel more unsafe," Jake acknowledged. "We defended ourselves in ways that probably looked aggressive to people who didn't understand what we were defending against." The conversation had continued for nearly 2 hours, with both sides finally able to articulate their perspectives without defensiveness or accusation. Jake explained the importance of motorcycle culture and veteran brotherhood to people who had served together and needed continued connection to survive civilian life. Carmen explained the impact of sudden change on a stable residential community and the particular fears parents felt when they couldn't predict what constituted safe environment for their children. The agreement they reached was imperfect but workable. The Iron Brotherhood would relocate to a more suitable property where their activities wouldn't conflict with residential neighborhood expectations. The residents would drop their formal complaints and agree not to interfere with the Iron Brotherhood's search for new housing. Both sides would publicly acknowledge that the conflict had been based on misunderstanding rather than malicious intent. Marcus Phillips pled guilty to arson charges and was sentenced to community service and restitution for the destroyed motorcycles. Bobby received a similar sentence for vandalism. Both young men's actions were treated as products of community conflict rather than individual criminal intent. 6 months later, Cypress Ridge Road had returned to its previous quiet character. The Iron Brotherhood had found property outside Clearwater where they could maintain their lifestyle without neighborhood conflict. Carmen Santos and her family had chosen to stay, though they kept their doors locked more carefully than before. Tom Bradley and Pete Morrison had maintained contact with some Iron Brotherhood members, occasionally joining them for rides and developing friendships based on shared interests rather than proximity and conflict. The territorial markings had been removed by county work crews, leaving only faint traces of the symbols that had meant so much to both sides during the months of escalating fear and pride. Sheriff Crawford kept the incident files as training material for conflict resolution, using the Cypress Ridge Road situation as an example of how reasonable people could create unreasonable conflicts when communication broke down and assumptions replaced understanding. The most lasting impact was on the individuals who had lived through the escalation and recognized how easily they had been pulled into a dynamic that served no one's actual interests. Carmen Santos became involved in community mediation training, helping other neighborhoods address conflicts before they reached crisis levels. Jake Morrison joined a veterans organization focused on helping former service members successfully transition to civilian communities. Maria Santos, whose wisdom had been ignored during the crucial early weeks of the conflict, continued hanging laundry in her backyard and watching the road with the understanding that came from having seen fear and pride transform neighbors into enemies, and enemies back into neighbors who had simply needed better ways to understand each other. The street belonged to everyone and no one, as it always had. The difference was that now everyone understood the cost of forgetting that simple truth.